I want to welcome you all to Delta Think's second discussion forum based on our popular News and Views series. We've again had a great response to today's session, so thank you, and we're looking forward to having a lively and very interactive discussion with you all today. We'll start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for you today. I'd like to introduce our speakers and News and Views authors. We have Ann Michael, founder of Delta Think and chair of the board, and also Chief Digital Officer at PLOS. And then we also have Dan Pollock, Chief Digital Officer at Delta Think, and along with Ann, an architect of Delta Think's open access data and analytics tool. And they are our speakers today. If you joined us for the first News and Views discussion forum back in April, you know that the format for these discussion sessions is interactive and informal, so we welcome your questions and your participation. Our speakers will openly discuss their views and even test each other. They may offer differing views and opinions at times, and again, we welcome your feedback as well. A few logistical items before we begin. If you can ask your questions in the Q&A box, that would be great. We'll have some opening remarks from our speakers to start us off, and then we'll move into questions after that. And just to set expectations, because this is meant to be a bit informal, we've scheduled an hour, but if there are fewer questions, we may end earlier. It's all up to the level of participation. So again, we welcome your interaction with us today. At this point, I am going to turn this over to Ann to get us started, and thank you again for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Unless you think that our News and Views topics come up at random, I want to assure you that they don't. So this particular topic is a natural part of us preparing to do a major update to our open access data and analytics tool. In the late summer, we do a market sizing update. And in preparation for that, we start to poke around at our own data and at other data that's available in the ecosystem and start to look for any trends, anomalies. And just as you would do in anyone familiar with data analytics, you often start from an exploration perspective. And then as you find things that pique your interest or you believe could provide value to the community, if the question were answered, you start to have a more targeted approach. And that's exactly what happened here. So we've focused in on open access uptake. And as Dan will discuss in a few seconds, he'll go through the headlines. But it was, this is part of our kind of first dive into our data and some data from Unpaid, and Dan will talk about that too. But dives are funny. You can do many of them. You can do more of them. So while this deep dive might not answer every question, what we really do hope is that as we're talking today, if you're struck by questions or thoughts about this information that would provide you with more value, that you would either, let us know through chat or through questions. If we can answer questions about the data because we've done the analysis, we'll let you know. But you'll also help us to queue up things that we might want to analyze and publish in News and Views at a later time. So with that in mind, why don't we jump right in, Dan, and talk about our findings?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So just quickly before I go into findings, I want to talk a little bit about how we frame them and definitions, because these things are important. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on methodology, but just so we know we're speaking a common language. We wanted to look at the proportion of the marketplace that by volume of article output, that's open access. Really, that's the kind of the core of this analysis. But open access means slightly different things to different people. So I just want to clarify how we define open access for the purposes of our analysis. We're not advocating a position on it. That's not our job. We're just there to look at the data. But we think it's important people understand what definition we're using so they can then align it with whatever their own definitions or languages. So very briefly, we define open access to mean articles that are both free of charge to read and also freely reusable under a permissive reuse license. Typically, that would be some sort of Creative Commons license. So that's open access, free to read and free to reuse. We contrast that with public access, which is simply free to read. You don't have to pay anything, but there may be restrictions on reuse. And then there's some other moving parts, closed access or paid access, and then the notions of repository only access, things that are only available, not available from publishers' websites. But I wanted to just make that differentiation between open access and public access, so we're clear about what we're talking about. And then really onto our headline findings. And if you have questions about those definitions, please do throw them into the Q&A, and I'm sure we'll get into some of them as Anne and I discuss things further. But really, our two takeaway headlines are: number one, that the proportion of articles being produced open access, following our definition, continues to grow every year. So open access continues to take market share, but its rate of growth is slowing. So it's growing a little bit less each year, as it were, if you like, the curve of growth is flattening off. And secondly, that if you then look at the sorts of journals that are offering open access articles, we actually find that if you look at hybrid journals, which of course offer mixed models, and journals which offer no open access option at all, in other words, they don't advertise an open access option to their authors, in actual, the proportion of open access in those journals is doing quite well. And essentially, if you were to pick up two journals, like a hybrid journal or a journal without an open access option, there's a very good chance you'll find open access stuff in it. There's quite a sort of significant amount of open access content coming out in those journals. And in actual fact, journals that don't advertise open access options, sort of fully closed journals, in actual fact seem to publish a greater proportion of their content open access as compared with hybrids, which we found to be quite important. Just bear in mind that those closed journals, those ones without an open access option, that's very much the editor's or publisher's choice. They may choose to make some of their content open, either permissively or with restrictions. So that's our two headline findings. I think the interesting thing, the discussion, I'm going to kick this back to Anne, is really why those headlines might be happening.
Laura, did you want to?
Yes. Dan, just before we move on, there's just a question on the definitions. So you defined OA as free to read and permissive reuse, some kind of Creative Commons license, but that includes CC by NC and D.
Yeah.
So that seems not permissive reuse.
That's a very good and subtle point. The underlying data set we're using is from the folks at Unpaid, and that's the same data that I think is now in pretty broad use across most of the major indexes. So we think that's a reasonably solid data set. We're essentially following their definitions of those licenses, and I do believe, I can double check this sort of afterwards, but I do believe that not ND license, that non-derivatives license, is included in their definition of open access. So fair point, well made. We have looked into this in a separate data set, the stuff from the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. I think that non-derivative bit is a very small proportion of the overall open access output, but nonetheless, yes, absolutely it is there. And that question also brings up an interesting point, which is it's actually quite difficult to get to this information. Unpaid will do a good job of automatically going through content and trying to piece together licenses. And I think, as we've written about in previous of our news and views pieces, we lack a commonly used and fully robust industry standard for actually capturing this information. So inevitably there will be some inaccuracies in there as well.
And Dan, just to chime in there too, I think, and one of the things about definitions in general, we need to define something, as Dan said, not because of advocating a particular position, but because we have to have a consistent way to analyze data. We have to look at it. And when we do that in a consistent fashion, then it helps us to see trends. So one of the things that happens, and we talk about this a whole lot, is that you always do the best you have with what you have. And then in time, hopefully, data gets better and better and better. But yeah, that's a really fair point. Dan, moving back.
And actually, so can I come back on that? I think that consistency is important, because we do employ the same sort of method over the data going back in time. So that means as you look for changes and trends, that's where that consistency is really important. And yes, okay, maybe the total proportion is moving by 1 or 2 percentage points, depending on the definition. But as long as you're using the same thing over time, you know, whether there's a lot of it or a little of it, I mean, that's the kind of important directional trends you're trying to get out of the data.
Right. And if data gets better in the future, you pull it out and you can do that. So just getting back to the findings, one of the things Dan and I discussed, and by the way, Dan and I will often interrupt each other and talk and disagree and stuff. So, you know, don't worry, you're not like, you know, witnessing a fight or anything. We do this all the time. So why we started to have a discussion about, well, why do we think that it's flattening? What could be happening that in the market? Now, this is conjecture, but what could be causing this? I don't know, Dan, you want to start?
Yeah, well, so we kicked some ideas around, and I think, you know, back to Anne's point, as you explore data, I think it's important to keep an open mind and experimental mindset. So the first thing was okay, so we're looking at the flattening off at the rate of growth of open access. Could this be something to do with the hybrid side of things? Could it be that there's a shift in demand from one to the other? Or, you know, we've reached a saturation point or something like that. Maybe there's a move from fully open access journals into hybrid journals. And the first thing we looked at as we dived into the data to try and explore that particular hypothesis, if that's not too grand a word, is that it seems the rate of growth is slowing, whether or not it's sort of open access in fully open access journals or it's open access in hybrid or elsewhere. Generally, all the curves are beginning to flatten off as they go over time.
And that's another point too, is that when you think about the rate of change initially on a very small base, the rate is going to be very high. So while we're not stating that, you know, we're at the point where we're going to see less and less OA, I don't actually believe that, but the percentage of what's out there is getting smaller and smaller too. So then we started looking about, you know, at absolute article volumes. And again, you know, just as you would assume, there does appear to be this flattening. And so we started to talk about the idea. So in Delta Think, there's also a lot of research that's been done just around author perceptions. And, you know, we wonder if we're getting to a point where there's some kind of a need for additional author education. Is it that the market, it's slowing because the people that were very much aware and understood the benefits of open access, the authors that were pursuing that are pursuing that, and now again they are pursuing that at a decreasing rate. So, you know, so is it a mature market, or is it a case where it's market behavior, it's the actual behavior of folks in the market and not understanding or, you know, supporting open access in some fashion, whether passively or actively?
And I mean, that sort of gets us into some interesting points. You know, why might the market be maturing? What's influencing those behaviors? And I think eventually you've got to start then saying, well, what's incentivizing authors' behavior? And that's eventually going to get you to funders and compliance and mandates and things like that. And that's where I felt things started to get interesting. So, for example, if you look at the UK, which has got a very centralized academic funding system, very strong open access mandates, we see a very high degree of open access take-up within that particular region. So that market's actually quite mature. I know there's been some research done on that. So, because naturally, if you look historically, you'll see an increase in adoption and then a flattening off. The question then is, how's that advancing across other regions? So, for example, Plan S is the obvious, I think, talking point to sort of see whether or not, as that starts to take effect and those mandates start to land, will we see an increase across Europe? But then compare and contrast with other territories. The US is effectively a public access requirement coming out of government-funded research. We think at the moment, OSTP, etc., we know that might change. And similarly, you know, we don't really know which way China will go. So it's quite a complicated world out there. But we think that the funder mandates really and funder policies are one of those key drivers and influences of author behavior and selection. You know, as we know, I don't know, Anne, if you want to expand on that at all.
No, I know we have a bunch of questions now, so maybe Laura, you could chime in.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions about how the survey was conducted or how the information was gathered. One being, it sounds like the survey was only looking at forms of gold open access, not picking up green versions. And then another question around comparative studies of preprint numbers. Were we able to do any of that?
Okay, so I'll take them in order. The numbers we looked at look at everything that's been published. So we're trying to compare total output and then look at, so gold, which again, these definitions can mean different things to different people, but I think typically tends to mean open access articles in fully open journals. I believe that's the sort of quote formal unquote definition, but please don't sort of shout at me if I get it wrong. But what we were doing was breaking out those forms of open access. So we were looking at open access articles in different journal types, along with articles that were paid access only, and articles that are public access, aka bronze. Sometimes people talk about sort of bronze open access. For us, we would just call that public access articles. Green's interesting. The way we looked at it, it reflects the way the underlying on-paywall data is framed. If you look at and they're very good papers, you look at the papers that the Unpaywall team have produced, I think there's a couple of them, the green colouring on their charts is actually repository only. So these are articles that are only available in repositories. They are not available in publishers' websites. And that would actually straddle kind of what's classically defined as green, if you will, which could be articles that are essentially under embargo. So they may be articles on publishers' websites that are paid access for a period of time and then moved outside the paywall and put under some sort of open license. So we really have it on our ongoing research agenda to start to pull out those more subtle definitions of green and dive into the data, maybe in further analysis in due course.
And Dan, just to chime in there on that, I think it's really important to understand too that part of the mission of where Unpaywall started, which is where can I see something for free? Where can I find this article for free? And that framing impacts some of the data definitions. So, which is awesome. Like it's an amazing data set, but you have to always understand from a data perspective how something evolved to make sense of which conclusions you can draw from it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very good point. And then I think the preprint thing, the very short answer is no, we haven't yet. Good idea. That's something we can look into. I do know that Unpaywall does look at articles in preprint service. So what it does is it basically starts with a DOI, and their technology will go out and search, I think, something like 200 or 300 odd sources, websites to find versions of articles of that DOI, and then they do some further processing to figure out, right, what, if you like, is the preferred version, note the quotes, and they have a sort of simple hierarchy. So they will always prefer a version, I think, on the publisher's website, but that doesn't mean they haven't captured information about articles in repositories as well. So there's some very rich subtlety to the data I dare say we could get into. I should also add, we do additional stuff to the Unpaywall data. We relate it back to some publishers' own price lists and some other models we've got to try and finesse information about journals and things like that. I'm slightly glossing over this because I'm conscious I don't want to spend the whole time talking about definitional subtleties. I'm happy to, obviously, but we're aware that people may want to explore other ideas as well. So I hope that covers those two aspects.
Yeah, we do have another question here. Yeah. I can see it, Laura, so I'll take this one. Can you explain the flattening in relationships to the country consortia level RAP PAR deals being signed, which are expected to lead to 90% or so OA within the confines of those deals? And actually this is really interesting because I think this will get us into the business model discussion that we wanted to have too. And Dan, one thing I think that might be clear too is what was the date of the poll on the data from?
It was end of April.
Okay, so just so we understand the time frame, and my personal opinion is I don't think we're seeing a big shift in the data yet. related to those deals, but a good point is made. I don't. Do you want to comment on that, Dan? And then I'm happy to add.
I confess I'm not entirely sure where the question's heading. So
so the author can feel free to put in a clarification, but my understanding is what he's asking about is how do we think, or how will this impact open access and where it's located as more and more, as those deals start to really gain steam, and if they do result in a big shift towards the open access portion of the wrap PAR specification.
Got it. So it's back to this thing about localization. Of course, there's going to be pressure within those regional areas. And I think one of the challenges about adoption of open access is that publishing is a global endeavor. So if you are a journal publisher and you're finding that a proportion of your journal, let's just think you've got one journal to keep it conceptually easily. If a proportion of that journal's input falls under some of these read and publish or publish and read deals, of course, authors in those regions only are going to want to move to an open access option, and some of them may be forced to say, well, we can't submit unless your journal flips to fully open access, let's say, under some of the stronger mandates. But what does that say for the rest of the world? And you know, what happens if you, let's say, get 30% of your submissions from a few regions that have got quite strong mandates, but in actual fact, the remaining 70% is coming from elsewhere. And of course, your subscription revenues may have a very different balance. So I think this then gets us into the conversation of how publishers are going to deal with those different commercial pressures coming from different territories. And I remember, I think Web of Science, the team of Web of Science put out a very interesting report last quarter of last year, where they started to analyze this, again based I think on some of the Unpaid data, and started to ask the question about footprints in fairly big name journals, and that some of the higher impact factor journals actually have quite a considerable proportion of their submissions coming from these high mandate countries. So open question, how are they going to deal with that? Are those submissions suddenly start to fall off? I don't have an answer for it. We can observe those trends, and I think it really will depend on how the mandates pan out, whether the mandates become negotiable. We know we have seen a shift in position, for example, in the Plan S mandates and so on. I mean, Anne, very interested to get your take on this.
No, I'm really, we've had this discussion for a while too about like what is going to impact this. What are the changes that we might see in data? And obviously there are these deals that we're talking about, but there's also, how big an impact is Plan Us, or what OSTP comes out with, how big is that going to have, an impact is that going to have? The other thing is, the big, gorilla in the room here too is, what about just budget? I mean, so right now we're in the middle of a situation where we're going to likely see unprecedented pressure on the normal purchasers of content, whether that be a subscription purchaser in a traditional environment, or whether that be centralized OA funding, or whether it be individual or OA funding. So, one of the things that we've been talking about is, and I know Lori's here, so there might be another question from the audience, but after that question, what I would like us to get to is, what could be the impact of these budget constraints? Is this going to be, a boon or a bust for OA in general? How might that play out? Lori?
Yeah, so we have another question regarding the information. So are you restricting your analysis to journal articles, or being more expansive to say OA monographs or chapters or other research outputs that can be found in IRs, preprint servers, and the fact that Plan S will affect book publishing aspects as well?
I'll start with that too, and Dan, you can add. So obviously we're looking at, the majority of what we're looking at is the unpaywall data. So my first answer to that is actually we are being much more focused on articles and journals, and partially because that's the data that we're dealing with. And Dan, I'm sure we've talked about this before. We've done some work on books before, but we've not really had to dive very deeply into that information, mostly because, quite frankly, this is what people ask us about most. But Dan, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
No, absolutely. The focus is on journal articles. I should add that's quite a broad bucket. These actually follow. We trace this back to the cross-ref definitions because a lot of this stuff is driven by DOIs. And a cross-ref quote journal article unquote is quite a broad church. It can include peer-reviewed stuff, but it can also include things like letters or errata and so on and so forth. And there's actually no easy way to separate out that data. That is something that we're looking into for a future analysis, but it's certainly not trivial. There is some data in the set looking at some, basically if it has an ISSN in quotes, and that can bring in sort of book series and I think some sort of monograph series. We've played around with that data behind the scenes. I have to confess it's a very, very small part of the overall output. So I don't think it's going to affect the headline numbers in our trends. But then in terms of the impact on books, yeah, and absolutely to Anne's point, it's a separate analysis, and it's something really we haven't been asked to look into as much as the journal article output.
Dan, one thing interesting to add, I think that is something that we run into all the time. And so a lot of times we do analysis and we talk about averages, and we might talk about over the whole market, or even into a particular specialty or a particular geographic region. And one thing that we always caution people to understand is that an average is an average. It's there to say, what is this like? Where are we, fundamentally, where are we going? Where's the trend going? But the only way to really understand more about how your specific institution is, or how a deep subspecialty is going, is to get to that data. And your interest, your question, what's really important to you may or may not be reflective of the average. So so my point is that we also are trying not to put everything together. So I would think that, Dan, if there's a point where we get into chapters and monographs, because that's a need that is being raised to us, that we would always want to, we might have aggregate, but we always want to keep it separated out too, so that we can preserve a little bit more guidance there.
I think that's an important point. We have this huge database behind the scenes. The point of maintaining that with all of the work that entails is because we can then start to dice and slice things, pull out different content types and so on. A really good example of how quote your mileage may vary, well, averages are different depending on your perspective, is that if you look at the data as a whole, just looking at the numbers of journals, how many fully open journals versus hybrid versus not open access journals, the data set as a whole, very, very roughly, it's split into 3/3. Not quite, but sort of roughly, if you look at it on the chart. If you then filter that data to just the really large publishers that account for like 60, 70% of the output, those proportions shift very, very significantly. And all of a sudden, hybrid starts to take over 70 or 80% of the number of journals with fully open access. And then there's actually a very small minority that have no advertised open access option at all. So there's a simple example of just by taking a very quick cut of the data, you can see the averages shift quite significantly. And I noticed, Laurie, you've cut in here. Is there another question that we...
Yeah, so one definition question around what's the universe of journal titles? What is defined as a journal in the first place?
In a paywall specifically.
Yeah.
So this is a question, I think, about the underlying unpaywall data set. Essentially, we go off, and this is where we do a little bit of our own definitional changes. So I can't speak for unpaywall here. I'm simply not affiliated with them. And as I said, it's a very widely used data set. So we think it's a fair representation. But basically, has it got an ISSN? Can they pick up on it? We usually link that back to then the Crossrefs list of journals. And essentially, if the DOI is classified under the Crossrefs journal article type, then effectively that falls inside our bucket. The inference there, and it is of course an inference, is that the parent containing publication is essentially a journal, because otherwise why would you have a quote journal article sitting in that bucket? If you've got a book chapter, that would sit in a different Crossref bucket, and so therefore wouldn't fall in our data set. We do go a little bit further. One of the pieces of analysis that we do, we haven't published it on one of our open pieces yet, but we do work on stuff like that, is we like to dig into particular discipline areas, see how things break out. What does it look like if you're a health science publisher or a physical science publisher, or go into even narrower definitions. And for those sorts of things, we will narrow things down further, and we'll look to overlap those, so that broad list of quote journals, i.e. stuff with journal articles in it, and then we'll crosswalk that based on ISSNs to the Cymago data set, which is basically based on Scopus. There are some public cuts of that, Cymago and CWTS, and they have subject categorization on a journal by journal basis. So we can basically have a look at, say, well, what subset of those broad list of journals look like they're being indexed in essentially the Scopus index and are falling into that CWTS categorization system, the All Science Journal Code System, ASJC. I think I've got that acronym correct. That means we'll narrow our search further, but that enables us then to model the data set based on subject classification and see how patterns vary in between different disciplines. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a complicated answer to your question.
I'm actually laughing here, Dan, because I'm thinking to that person, this is what happens when you ask Dan a methodology question.
But essentially, it's what we think Crossref defines as a journal would be the too long that didn't read.
That's the short answer.
I thought that one was going to be a short answer. The next question is a little lengthy, but a good one, as all of them have been. So given that the U.S. executive order hasn't happened, and that it's focused on public access, not open access, have we begun to think about how the business models of publishers will adjust if the executive order were to happen? And our questioner goes on further to say, what I'm getting at here is whether the publishers will need to shift to pay to publish in order to avoid subscription drops or price pressures if large numbers of the journal articles are available as public access.
I'll start on this one, Dan. So, one of the things that's interesting about this, and I was fortunate, and as I'm sure probably many of you on the call were, to attend some of the OSTP meetings and to listen to different publisher responses to this. Of course, I was there as PLOS, and for us, everything's open, and this the impact we care more about is people recognizing the cost of making things open, that it just doesn't naturally happen. But for publishers in a subscription environment, I think this is a really excellent question. If all of a sudden you're being kind of encouraged over what the OSTP has said won't be overnight time frame, but still that not an overnight time frame to the OSTP could be 5 years, which many folks on this webinar might consider to be quite a short time frame. But if you're being pushed in that direction where public access is going to be required with zero embargo, it does make sense that you're going to want to figure out how you can preserve revenue, because as we all know, as the percentage of that 0-day embargo content increases within your publication, corpus, libraries understandably are going to start to have a little bit, push a little bit harder on pricing. So I think it's really a great point, and I think it's very likely that if this were, there's a lot of ifs, if the OSTP comes out, if they're hard line on 0-day embargo for everything they fund, if a particular publisher is greatly impacted by what they do. So for example, I've worked with publishers where 80% of what they publish is NIH, and then I've worked with other publishers where it's a lot more nominal. So that 80%er is going to have to really think about switching either to some APC-based open access model or some other open access model, or you're exactly right, they're going to find that overnight or in that time frame of transition, once that's official, that they're going to be in danger of a whole lot of their subscription clients saying, wait a second, all of this stuff is public access, zero embargo. Why am I paying you this much money? Yeah. And Dan, I won't go on so if you have something to add. But
no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, number one, that's why we're careful to separate quote open access from public access, because it's quite fascinating. The thing with public access, and we debate this internally, is because you don't necessarily get any money from it if you can't charge a subscription. unlike the kind of the full open access option where typically people may pay to publish an APC model or something else. So the question is, if a good chunk of journals output starts to shift to effectively a 0-day embargo, what do you then do? You start charging for publication services and are effectively being pushed into a sort of a flip. And then, you know, at some point, where is the tipping point to a quote fully open journal? And then that's something we started to talk about in terms of developing models. We've got, I think Zan said, a kind of a standing editorial plan, as it were. And the OSTP has meant we kept delaying the bit when we think, right, where are we going to actually get into this and figure out how might we model what's happening? And then we've got to have a conversation and discussion about where are these thresholds? If 10% of your output's open, does that lead to some sort of pricing pressure? What about 50? What about 80?
So that's actually, there is, I mean, anecdotally, there's information on that. And not to mention what I was just, you know, it has historically been, you start to get to be around 40. Now you might get price pressure before this, but you start to get around 40 or more and you start to get flipping pressure. Like, you know, if a large portion of your journal is open. But one knock-on effect, which I was just thinking about, was when Plan S defined transformative, and I believe they said it started at 50, but I think they went up to 75, Dan. I have to go look. I don't remember the exact number. Maybe someone on the call, I'm sure does. But when they started said that 75% got to be open access, that they would be requiring their, you know, if someone submitted that journal to flip, which was what, you know, sparked the whole, you know, I know Springer Nature had comments, and then Plan S changed the number, and I think they made it 75%. So it could be, if you are one of those lucky people that has, you know, a lot of US funding and you're getting funding from Plan S folks, and again, this probably isn't the average person, but I'm sure there are going to be some publishers that are smaller publishers that find themselves in this position, then you might be forced to flip just because you have all the zero embargo stuff for OSTP, and now you're hitting the threshold where Plan S funding, if that's a percentage, is also going to have mandates.
And I think where that tipping point is going to vary, or journal by journal. I was about to say publisher by publisher. It's going to vary journal by journal and have sort of the publisher's own sensibilities and own approaches factored into it.
You know, Dan, one thing I'm thinking from a future perspective as an analysis is I think we should maybe try to see if we can figure out if it may be nothing, but what is the overlap between the NIH funding and Plan S funding? You know, what's the
well, because that, I mean, that's a whole topic about joint authorship, and then of course whose mandate applies.
Oh, no, don't solve it now. I'm just saying.
No. The other thing, just in terms of thinking about future analysis and how you frame this question, is sometimes you need to flip this around. So there may not be a threshold that says if you hit X%, then Y happens. But sometimes what we do is we'll just pick maybe 2 or 3 thresholds, and then we'll say, well, okay, what happens if the market shifts? So I don't know, 80%, 50, and 20 or something, and then we can see what happens, plug in some assumptions about values from the different business models, and then you can get to some interesting what if scenarios that way, and then that can help people inform their decisions and say, you know, well, it looks like if a little changes, not a lot will, but hey, you know, once we get above that 50% or whatever, then all of a sudden things start to accelerate. Laurie.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Lisa posted it is 75%. Yes.
So, and another question also, have we done any analysis yet? Has Delta Think done any analysis yet of library subscriptions on the journals that are already at a high percentage? And the cancellation, that the libraries may cancel those subs.
So just to start, we have, and it's confidential work that we've done, but we have worked with consortia and other people that are negotiating so the percent of hybrid is an interesting point because it actually takes a little analysis to figure out what you how much of it is research articles and whatnot. So we've done that analysis and helped support some consortia and libraries as far as understanding what percent of their current portfolio of are hybrid and what is the percent uptake within those journals. And that I think supports them as they're having discussions with publishers. I mean, this is one step beyond, which I think is kind of cool. And I don't know, Dan, do you want to take a shot at this since I've been talking about?
I think one of the challenges, you first got to get at the data. And of course, a lot of subscription financial information is confidential to a particular library or consortium. So I really don't know how we'd approach doing that at scale. Anecdotally, kind of a couple of things are rattling around. Number one, I do remember back in the kind of, I think, mid-noughties-ish, when preprint servers were first taking off, there was concern amongst publishing circles that just making preprints available could somehow undermine publishing, conventional publishing business models. And I believe some studies were done around then. And there was a similar concern about, well, you know, why would librarians bother? They could just go to sort of preprint servers and stuff like that, and this and that. That never really came to pass. I think most people are comfortable allowing their authors to post on preprint servers. So then when we move to, okay, well, what happens if you can actually get the final versions of record available? Well, again, will the OSTP rules, for example, actually specify the version of records, or the author's accepted manuscript? So there could be a differentiator there. There may be other ways for publishers to look at this, different ways of adding value. And then finally, we've had this thing called Sci-Hub. Now, the Unpaid data does not use that. It looks at legitimately free to read articles. I have to stress that. But there is an interesting, I think, conceptual discussion about, well, in some ways, all of this stuff has been available anyway, illegally, absolutely. But unlike, say, the recording industry, which went into free fall after Napster hit within about 18 months, we haven't seen that happen in the scholarly publishing industry. And I think there's some interesting, you know, kind of qualitative analysis to be done maybe around why that's happening.
So, but the point is very well taken that for this question, which is this really, you know, we'd have to sit there and figure out if we can find data on cancellations, if the reason for those cancellations were due to open access uptake, and try to draw some lines. So we have not done that analysis, and our information, just like yours, I'm sure, is very anecdotal. You know, we see the press releases, we talk to folks, we talk to some people, and we hear what their negotiations are going like, but it's not like a hard data set that we could form or use at this point.
And maybe one other thing is, the cancellations may never manifest, because as people respond differently, we may find increasing read and publish or publish and read deals, which are emerging to prevent the cancellations and thereby sort of keeping the system stable. That's quite hard to measure because you've got no control. You can't say, well, what happened if they didn't sign the deal? Where would it have gone? So it's an interesting analysis to get into, I think.
And one of the interesting things too, and this always happens in data analysis, is there's the actual things that we can know, and then there's kind of like the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. There's no denying that there's a sentiment about, you know, the increase of OA, and that should be one of the factors. There are others that push towards, you know, pressure on subscriptions, you know, journals and pricing. You know, and so when anyone gets into these, like, well, there's this and this happens in this case and that case, it's kind of like when you as a consumer have to refer to your contract when dealing with someone who's working on your house or anything else. The relationship already is pretty bad if that's where we're going. And I think that's fundamentally the issue. There's another question here. I'm going to read it. And Dan, so you take the first shot at this. Would be interested to hear the group's perspective on the Elsevier Netherlands deal. Are people concerned Elsevier has effectively traded open access journal publishing to tie up all the future open research infrastructure? How can new companies offer services if all the budget now goes to or been spent on Elsevier?
Thanks for that one. So, I mean, to unpack that a little bit, I can't obviously comment on Elsevier's intent, and forgive me, I don't have all of the details of the deal in front of me. I mean, it's no secret that Elsevier has gone out there. It's really pushing the fact that it is offering analytics services, and it's got a whole bunch of services coming out there. So in some ways, from a sort of 60,000 foot perspective, it's a logical way to sell products into the librarian marketplace. Kind of, why wouldn't any company with that sort of setup do it? And I think for any company selling into, especially the larger institutions, the more you can have under one umbrella, the better. The fewer deals you have to cut, the greater the economies of scale. Of course, you will advertise that as a way of driving down effective per unit pricing, however you choose to measure that. The buyer will, of course, have their own perspective on it. As to sort of how other companies fit in, I think that all depends how big a footprint that the content coming under that deal takes up. And even though we have a very highly consolidated marketplace, that much is definitely true. We don't have one clear monopolistic player necessarily. I know some people may take different views about certain players, but even the largest publisher accounts for 10, 12, 13% of the volume of output. So I'm not sure one player can necessarily displace everybody that simply, but there is, I think, a slightly different view on this, which is, and Anne alluded to it earlier, we're coming into a period where budgets are going to be very tight. And we've written previously about how library budgets have simply not kept up. They've effectively been flatlining compared with institutional budgetary increases. When the whole institutional budget's cut and the library budget's cut, then it's going to be an open question of who pays for anything. And I think that's kind of the more interesting question, how the balance of power is going to shift within the kind of the university system. And
there are two things that we've discussed about this that are probably interesting to bring up. So one of the things that we were talking about was, from a publisher perspective, what is a small or mid-sized publisher, to do in an environment where you're going to get a lot of pressure on pricing? So we've recently seen ASCO go to Wolters Kluwer in a partnership. We've seen ASBMB go to Elsevier with the intent of going fully open access, which is very interesting. And so, what that makes us think is, is this consolidation that we've been seeing and that we already see with a few large players in the market, is that, a trend that's going to continue? And, is there some process, some way that smaller or mid-sized publishers can, kind of at least stem and survive and hopefully succeed and thrive in the environment where we're in right now, and which we think is only going to be exacerbated going forward. So, Dan, did you want to comment on that first?
I just wanted to comment on that before Laurie came in, but Anne, of you, another thing that strikes me about this is we may be seeing a shift in the nature of the scholarly publishing market, because I think that there's a good point behind the question. If you're small in all this, how do you get budget that the much bigger organizations are effectively going to get first dibs on? But another way of looking at this is say, okay, if you're a large organization, you can start to position yourself as a services provider to the small organizations. And then we can get into the conversation of what is a brand of a journal or a brand of a small scholarly publisher. Publishing services are nothing new. Smaller publishers going to larger publishers to provide the infrastructure, do some of that kind of heavy lifting is nothing new. So maybe we'll see that trend continue, where the short answer to the question is, how's a small publisher going to get involved? Well, you're going to have to go onto a large publisher platform. The obvious analogy here is Amazon. Fulfilled by Amazon, you, the consumer, see one platform. There are a lot of quite small providers feeding products into the back end of Amazon, and Amazon sitting in a very lucrative position in the middle, effectively acting as the warehouse. So could we see larger publishers move to a more kind of service-orientated?
Right, but the question is, Dan, what's their incentive to do so?
Yeah.
And just taking a step back for a second, one of the other things that I think is important to the survival and I think just to the health of smaller publishers going forward too is, so one problem that's having is it's hard to get in on the big deal if you're not part of somebody. So from the subscription side, and you've had that problem for a long time, that's not new. And now the other part is, even from the open access side, if there's pressure on APCs, that APC has been the predominant model. And so I can say, as a small mid-sized publisher at PLOS, one of the things that we've been really aggressively doing is looking towards non-APC open access models. So whether it's collective action, whether it's, kind of an all-you-can-eat subscription, which doesn't, it's kind of like our version of Wrap or Par, except it's based on what would have been publishing fees, but then it's also based on no cap, so that you can publish as much as you want, and your authors don't have to worry about paying those fees or getting them covered by the institution. And one of the reasons we did this is because when you look at RAP and PAR, all of a sudden now there's a layer of friction to do business with someone who's fully open access that didn't exist before, because now I'm with Wiley or someone else, and boom, you're an author, you can just publish your manuscript and no one's tracking you down for payments or whatnot, and so we wanted to reduce that level of friction. So I do think, my point is that I think the small and mid-size are going to need to figure out how to band together. It would be amazing if the larger publishers, respecting the fact that there are organizations that do want a certain amount of independence, that they offer services like you're saying, Dan. That would be really neat. I don't know what the incentive is to do so, to put that kind of cost into my infrastructure if I'm a large publisher, to enable something that I would have just wanted to make another type of deal with them.
I wonder if the incentive
anyway, I think we're running out of time.
Yes.
Yeah. So Lori.
Yeah, so we're going to start wrapping up because we are almost out of time at this point. And we're going to close with one last question here for both of you. So with resources of OA funding being impacted by COVID, is it reasonable to assume that budget constraints will impact spending on OA? And could budget constraints be a boon for submission rates to subscription journals?
I think actually that will depend how the cuts fall within the university system. So, and we've explored this, I think, in one of our earlier pieces as well. I think to begin with, certainly open access publishers could benefit from this because they can mop up, they can very rapidly respond to demand. If you have more articles coming in, then you immediately have more revenue coming in. Of course, subscription revenue takes a longer time to shift. But equally, if libraries which are already experiencing flat budgets are finding they're getting squeezed even further, then of course that could inevitably lead to subscription cancellations, the pulling apart of big deals. We started to see that happening. And so, who knows, that could be a boon to the open access publishers as well. Alternatively, we've just been talking about consolidation and publishers offering a sort of complete service. The larger ones in particular may well find it easier to snaffle more of a shrinking budget, in which case I suspect it would favour publishers with subscription, these mixed models at scale.
I think the core of this question also is really about submissions. So the point is, if I'm an author, and it gets back a little bit to the models that I was just talking about, if I'm an author and I want to submit an article and I cannot fund an APC, is that going to help subscription journals? Well, kind of to the point I just made, it could, but there are things that open access journals could be doing in order to remove that friction as well. Now, obviously that depends on funding, but by the same token, I think that, and this is a general statement that isn't always true, but there generally seems to be a desire to move towards open access in a lot of the library and institutional communities. So given that, there's an incentive to necessarily make a deal that would be smaller, scalable according to what they can do, that would then eliminate that friction for their author, in which case then going to a subscription journal isn't necessarily the only option they have if they can't personally fund an APC.
One other kind of comment that came in, I thought it's a good one, is of course for smaller organisations that are reliant on events revenues, as a lot of societies are, of course they've seen those very badly impacted. So, and that can pose real challenges, of course, for smaller organisations. Again, that then I think means if you're a very large organisation with a comprehensive set of journals you can offer, that probably puts you in a better position to respond to that. You've got deeper pockets, you're more resilient. And then of course that lots of smaller organizations are dropping off that and they're relying on subscription revenues, then of course that could.
Yeah, and another thing that, just thinking about this too, and someone mentioned preprints before, we're also in a situation where what's going on in the world, a lot of publishers have made a lot of their content related to coronaviruses and whatnot free to access. And I dare say, I don't want to say open access, but certainly free to access. And, so people have started, and I think we talked about this on the last webinar, people have started to say, well, why not Ebola? And why not these other things? And then quite frankly, I saw, and I don't believe they were the first one, I recently saw that Sage made their collection of content around, racial injustice and policing issues also freely accessible. And so what I'm also curious about is where we're going to get to that point where economics and values start to line up a little bit more. Is that, will that happen?
Very good. Thank you both. We're going to wrap up our session today. We are almost at the hour. Thanks so much to Dan and Anne for this great conversation today, and for everyone who joined us and contributed your great questions and comments. We really appreciate it. We'll be making the recorded version of the session available on our website, and you'll receive a notification when that's ready. And please feel free to share that with others, or you may want to revisit it and re-listen to portions as well. And we want to keep the conversation going, so feel free to email any of us with your follow-up questions or comments that you'd like to continue talking about. Lastly, we'll be holding our next session in early September, so be on the lookout for notification about registering for that. Probably mid to late August, we'll be posting that and sending that around. And we look forward to chatting with you all again. Stay healthy and well, and thanks again, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.